Welcome to Redirect, Immigration Law and Perspectives, a weekly dive into the world of immigration law and its human consequences. I'm your host, Stephen Robbins, joined shortly by co-host and fellow immigration attorney Matthew Archambault out of the great city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This week, we're talking about, there's just been so many of these seemingly little things that the Trump administration has done to really screw over immigrants. It seems like there's been some big ones. There's been some ones that have captured the attention of national media, including for extended periods of time. But so many of these have gone totally undetected because they take a minute to explain, or it seems kind of niche and it seems like maybe that's not such a big deal. But this is a pretty big one, and again, one that happened this week that really flew under the radar and that will affect many, many thousands of people who have been in our country a long time, who have kids here, who are fighting to stay in this country in removal proceedings. And they've made it significantly harder for those people to stay for literally no reason. So we talk about that decision. We hope you enjoy the conversation. It does get a little bit CLE. CLE is a continuing legal education credit that we have to get. These are like classes where you go and attorneys drone on about the law, and they've got slides. Look, if you ever teach a CLE, don't have a slide that is literally just the statute. Be creative. Don't put us to sleep. Anyways, but we try to get to the heart of it and make it accessible for all our lovely listeners. And let us know what you think. If you like the show, you can become a patron on patreon.com/redirect. Times are tough. I understand if you have to cancel your patronage or if you just can't afford it. If you can't afford it, we'd really appreciate it. The other thing you could do is take your money and donate it to one of many great organizations that are doing important work right now, like the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. We do donate part of our Patreon dollars to the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, but lots of good organizations doing important work right now. The Trump bucks, the money that people are getting, undocumented folks don't get that money. And they're also losing work and trying to support families. So there's ways that you can support some of those groups. Maybe next week we'll talk about some of those organizations or bring somebody on to talk about some of those funds that are out there. Folks, you can also subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, leave a review, say something nice, and enjoy the conversation with Matthew. Kind of weird to go out. Obviously there's a lot of social distancia that's going on. Distanciando.
Mm-hmm. Didn't people usually stay away from you anyways?
That's true, but it's also
in the
weird.
Best of times.
Yeah. I went to the bank. Now the bank's closed, except for the drive-through. And so there was a line out onto the street. And people are taking those, the tubes that shoot up through the bigger tube. You put your money in there. You know what I'm talking about?
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm watching, and this one guy's fiddling with it and then wiping his nose and then, fiddling with it and putting it. And it's just a big, long-ass line of cars. And I'm like, we're so incredibly
Were you wearing gloves?
Well, I went through the one closest to the wall, so I didn't have to touch anything. Well, pretty soon we'll all be getting those big, giant, fat Trump checks, and everything will be back to normal. Once you get your $1,200, you can sleep easy, knowing that all your
Why does anyone think that's going to make a difference? I mean,
even if you're really poor, right? Let's say you have a couple of kids and you're making $20,000. It's gonna what? Pay 1 month's rent and some bills and maybe a trip to the grocery store. Anyways, it's a bad choice. But what I wanted to talk about today, we've talked a lot about how this administration sucks in
what? Whoa.
In lots of little ways.
Generally they're bigly good, right?
Well, I love Trump now switching to the economy was so good. But it's bad in lots of ways that don't get coverage. So I saw Sarah Silverman tweet something about kids in cages the other day.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was really bad. Maybe the worst thing that he's done, although there's some contenders.
Oh no.
And
it's which part of the Holocaust was the worst? I don't know. Was it the gas chambers? Was it the firing squads? No, which one?
Right. Take your pick. But not to compare this to the Holocaust. That was Matthew's bad example, not mine, just so people are aware.
I'm reading from the show notes that Steven just sent me before the show. That's all.
Make a bad Holocaust analogy. I put that in your notes. No, but the way that they've been able to do lots of little sort of technical things that don't make the news, but that affect hundreds or thousands of lives is been really remarkable. And just as a quick aside, and maybe we already talked about this recently, but I do see I listened to the Majority Report. I'm a big Majority Report backer. And a guy called in the other day to say, I just can't vote for Joe Biden. He doesn't do anything for my family. I got kids in college. The price is astronomical. I've got healthcare bills. He had a list of very real and important grievances that need to be resolved, right? And he was feeling like Joe Biden just is not going to address those. But the immigrant community is going to be, they're already royally and it's going to be so much worse if he wins re-election. If you're a person who's capable of any type of empathy, I ask you to please put away any type of, he doesn't represent my values, or he, this or that. Like, you have to put that aside. The difference is real and it's stark. And that's from somebody who doesn't like Joe Biden. So
who right now would say, okay, we could just swap out Hillary Clinton for Donald Trump right now. Okay. And I'm not even talking about what's going to happen with the election. If your answer is, but what about Bernie? I don't want to talk to you. I just don't. Just stop.
We've been big Bernie
Hillary
backers.
Sucks.
And
and I love Bernie. I want Bernie to be president. He's not going to be president. And you know what? There is so much more going on that we have to deal with than to deal with that either injustice or lack of insight and intelligence on the Democratic voters. People always want to say, oh, it's rigged and all that, but people are voting. They really are. And yeah, I'm sure it's tilted, it's skewed and all that, but we have a fascist in the White House. So this is not the time. If Trump was just George Bush bad,
hold on. I mean, you're maybe forgetting the whole Iraq war thing.
Yeah, no, but I think Trump is worse. Trump goes to such a different level that you look back at Bush and you're like, yeah, he was bad, but he wasn't Hitler.
Yeah, well, okay. I don't want to get into this because,
how about if he was George Bush Sr. bad?
I think maybe the appropriate analogy is like Mitt Romney, right? So like if Mitt Romney were president and he were lowering taxes for rich people and expanding Obamacare or whatever, but, just sort of a milquetoasty Republican, maybe there's some argument for abstaining and trying to push the Democratic Party to respond to your lack of voting or something like that. But this is different. I think you're right about that. And one thing I will say about Bush and Iraq, like Biden voted for the war, which was terrible. And in my opinion, again, should be disqualifying. Like he's terrible and he's terrible for taking that.
Hey, don't ask me for grammar lessons. I don't know.
Jesus Christ. All right. So he shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't have done that thing.
That was bad.
That was bad. But we can't sit here and pretend like Donald Trump, as a member of Congress in 2002, wouldn't have done the exact same thing. Like, there's no way that Donald Trump in Congress would have been one of like 3 people to stand up and, you guys, we need peace. I'm against war. No, he would have been 100% for it. And so the idea that like somehow Trump isn't as bad because he didn't cast that vote, I think just ignores the fact that he wasn't in a position to have taken the vote in the first place. But anyways.
So what we're saying is you need to vote for Biden.
Yeah,
right?
Maybe you don't want to get into all there's many, many reasons, and we can do maybe a different show about that. But how about just DACA? Like just DACA. The fact that there's hundreds of thousands of young people who are now facing the very real possibility that the most conservative court in the history of the country is going to take away their status because Jeff Sessions had a DACA-ending boner in the Trump
Well,
administration.
now look what's going to happen now, right? Because we're expecting a decision at some point, and it's going to come now during this whole coronavirus thing and this like massive unemployment. And then, if everything was normal, maybe Trump could get the Republicans to pass some thing. But now there's no way. Like, once the Supreme Court cancels it, it's gone. Like, no one's going to want to touch it. And even Democrats aren't going to want to touch it now. So, I mean, they'll talk about it, but they won't do anything to really do it. And if Biden, a Democrat, becomes president, not only hopefully can we have something like DACA, but also he'll put people in place that will make the bureaucracy friendlier.
Yeah, and not necessarily.
And that's the thing that people overlook with Obama because of all the deportations, but he generally had people in place that were immigrant friendly, and it was a lot easier to work with people. The way they adjudicated things were different.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that people won't see that will be better.
Yeah, I mean, the Trump administration didn't just get more hostile. They literally ended things like liaison meetings where the private bar would meet with ICE leadership, or local ICE or local USCIS and have meetings about this is what we're doing. These are our concerns. And not that ICE was the post office back then, right? But there were conversations and they were open to hearing concerns. And that did make a material difference in the lives of a lot of people. And not only are they not responsive to our concerns anymore, they literally ended the meetings.
Well, do you remember InfoPass?
Right. I did want to say this one thing before we get into the meat of the show. Yesterday, a bunch of practitioners, including myself, got a rash of emails from the National Visa Center just saying hey, we know that you sent us an inquiry, and here's a copy of the inquiry. It's at the bottom of this email, but the coronavirus happened, and if you still need an answer, can you resubmit this inquiry that we're attaching to the bottom of this email? Did you get any of those?
All the inquiries go to my
to your assistant.
one of my paralegals. So I'll have to ask her.
Yeah, it was the weirdest thing. It was akin to a kid having a big science project, and then the coronavirus happens, and he's like, "Yeah, I couldn't finish it because of corona."
Oh well.
The corona happened, and
it was actually due a week before the coronavirus. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So I guess I got to resubmit all these inquiries, but that's another example. We used to be able to email the NVC. Now we have to submit an online inquiry thing, which is, onerous and annoying. Just all of these little things. And it's not just inconveniencing the attorneys. That would be one thing, but it's, like I said, materially affecting the lives of immigrants. So one recent example of this phenomenon, which didn't really make a lot of news, is a new decision by the Board of Immigration Appeals on this thing called extreme and exceptionally unusual hardship. So there's basically two types of immigration cases. There's cases that are what I call affirmative, where the immigrant or their attorney can file something, put it in the mail, and then something comes back to you, hopefully, a green card or a work permit. That's an affirmative process. And the immigrant is in control, right? They're at the driver's seat. And there's also defensive applications where ICE puts you in removal proceedings, and then in a defensive posture, you can present some sort of defense to deportation, which might actually result in you legalizing your status before the immigration judge. One of these defenses is called cancellation of removal. And in order to win, there's a bunch of requirements, but one of them is that you show that a citizen or a permanent resident, spouse, parent, or child will suffer extreme and exceptionally unusual hardship if you are deported. This type of a case used to be called suspension of deportation. And then in around 1998, the law changed and they required more continuous physical presence, and they raised the level of hardship from extreme hardship to extreme and exceptionally unusual. They just decided to make it more hardshipy. When did you start practicing?
2002.
Okay, so you didn't do a lot of suspension.
There were still a few kicking around at that time, but not a lot. And they were basically pretty easy,
Right.
So cancellation is a weird thing because some judges, it can be a breeze. And other judges, it's like impossible. And it's such a variance that you really have to know your judge and your court. And then, of course, the government attorney plays a huge part as well.
Right. When Congress passed this new law and they decided extreme hardship wasn't enough, we're going to require extreme and exceptionally unusual hardship. They also didn't define that in the regs. Would have been nice. They just put it out there. And then the BIA, over a series of 3 different decisions back in the early 2000s, decided to sort of shape what we understand extreme and exceptionally unusual hardship to be. So there are 3 seminal cases, and I'm sure you're super prepared to talk about those, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's see here. One is Montreal, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Do you want to talk about Montreal, or I've got summaries, so I can just go right into it if you want me to.
You go right into it.
Okay. So in Montreal, the respondent, the immigrant who was facing deportation, they lived in the United States for about 20 years. They had 3 qualifying relatives, U.S. citizen children ages 12, 8, and an infant, and also his LPR, permanent resident parents. Now, before trial, his wife had gone back to his country along with the infant child. So now he was alone in the U.S. with his 2 older kids. And there was nothing really submitted about the parents. The parents were sort of healthy. The father was still working. And so the board said, well, the kids are going to suffer some hardship, some economic deprivation, but you're actually going to be reuniting with your wife and your other child. Your parents are otherwise healthy. So that case was denied. So again, somebody with 3 U.S. citizen kids, LPR parents, but no real factor other than, he was the primary breadwinner for his family. And in fact, there was this weird fact, which is, that part of his family was already deported, essentially. The next case was Andazola, and that was also denied. And in that case, the respondent had 2 qualifying relatives, U.S. citizen children ages 11 and 6. She had a pretty good job. She had some assets. She had a home which was worth about $69,000. She had about $7,000 in savings. She also tried to call herself a single mother, but then at trial it came out that the father of the children lived with her and worked. And so I think that might have, they didn't say she lacked credibility or anything like that, but you get the sense in the decision that they were a little peeved about that. Her kids were in good health. She had concerns primarily over the general lack of quality education her children would receive in Mexico. And in this case, the board said that economic detriment alone is insufficient to support a finding of even the old standard, extreme hardship. And she had lots of family here in the U.S. that was undocumented. And they said, well, they can send you money if you need to. So that was that case. And then in Racinas, they granted cancellation. This is the 3rd case. The respondent in that case was a single mother. I know this is getting boring, kind of CLE, but single mother, no immediate family in Mexico. Her qualifying relatives were U.S. citizen children ages 12, 8, 11, and 5. She was the sole provider. She had limited financial resources. Her children had limited Spanish language skills. And she didn't have any immigration alternatives, so she had no other way to fix papers in the future. And in that case, it was granted. So it's hard to see exactly the contours of what hardship is, but the old factors that they still consider important are age of the qualifying relatives, their health, the respondent's ability to obtain employment in the country of removal, their length of residency in the United States, financial impact of the respondent's departure, impact of a disruption of educational opportunities, psychological impact of the foreign national's deportation, the circumstances or conditions in the country abroad, family ties to the country abroad. Basically, it's a weighing of all of the factors, and the hardship is supposed to be considered in the aggregate. So those 3 decisions were issued shortly after the law changed, and that's been the law ever since until earlier this week.
Yeah, but before we get into that, let's just have a little bit discussion about what that means in practice up till today, right?
Sure.
Where, generally speaking, if you have someone that has been here for a long time, they have multiple children, and say they have some children that are in the teenage years, the person doesn't have any criminal contact or very minimum, criminal contact. And you can show something to the children. And this is assuming that you have a decent judge. Most of the time, those cases, you can get through on those cases. Usually the government attorney, they won't put up too much of a fight. This is from my experience. Usually it turns more, even though it's never really hashed out in the decision and all that, on the person's, what they call their good moral character. If you have someone who's kind of impeccable there, the judge is usually willing to figure out the extreme unusual hardship. If you have someone that has a really sketchy past, they're really going to have a hard time, almost regardless of what the hardship is. But generally speaking, especially if you would have a kid that has some type of medical issue, and like the more severe, the better. If you walk into court and you're wheeling in a 7-year-old in a wheelchair on a ventilator that has Down syndrome, the judge is writing out the order for you right there. And you're like, yes, I have this awesome case, but these people have, a lot of challenges ahead of them in their lives. So the thing I think with cancellation is there's a standard, and some judges are kind of sticklers to it, but there has been kind of, I think from my experience, kind of a wink and a nod of, okay, they might not really be able to meet this standard, whatever this is, but we're going to let them through. And I've even had judges like look at the DHS attorney, the government attorney, and say, are you going to appeal? And they're like, no, we waive appeal. And they're like, good, because I could never write a decision to justify this grant under the standard. And that's under the old standard.
Right.
But now there's a new standard, which is now let's have a little pause. It was written, just recently by the Board of Immigration Appeals as a precedential decision, meaning it controls. And do people think it's A, a favorable decision for immigrants, B, a not favorable decision for immigrants, or C, catastrophic? So give everyone a little chance to
maybe we put
think about it.
Maybe we put the Jeopardy music in here. Let the whole song run out, so that when people come
they
back,
can write down their little answers. It doesn't have to be in the form of a question. And so, Stephen, what would the correct answer be?
Well, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. And just one last thing, I guess two things. Under the old standard, the bar was really high, but these 3 cases, they also said that, the bar isn't so high that deportation must be unconscionable, right? You don't have to show extreme and exceptionally unusual hardship. Doesn't mean that like someone has to die or somebody has to be raped and kidnapped in order for you to win, but it still has to be pretty bad. And it's almost like they're getting rid of that little caveat.
It's like about that one.
Yeah, actually, it does need to be unconscionable. That's basically what this decision is. And good moral character is a separate category of qualifying. So somebody could have the hardship, but not the character. To your point, I think it's certainly true that there are judges who, certainly not all of them, but some of them that do let those two things bleed together to where maybe somebody doesn't totally have the hardship, or the hardship is a little bit of a stretch, but they're a person of impeccable character and they might be inclined to grant. That's definitely true, but not always. There are judges who, like you said, are sticklers.
Certainly I imagine there are practitioners around the country that might be listening to this going,
what is he talking about?
Judges that would do that.
Yeah.
We don't have, maybe they practice in Atlanta or Dallas or something, somewhere else.
Yeah.
There are judges who they won't grant these cases almost ever unless someone's hooked up, in a coma or has brain cancer or something like that, which is also a gross misreading of the previous 3 cases, right? I think it's in Ray Montreal that kind of specifies you don't need a medical situation to be granted cancellation. There are practitioners and judges today who will still think
your case
you'll
sucks.
have judges well, what's the medical condition? There's no medical condition. Well, how are you going to do this then?
Right.
They can't even conceptualize. In the cases, all the 3 cases you said, I don't think there were really, in Racinus, there was any medical conditions in that or nothing,
right?
Nothing major, right?
No, there weren't. The only one.
Speaking of medical conditions, You want to talk about the new case?
Yeah, so this is a new case, matter of JJG. Now, of course, after 20 years with these three precedents, people kind of had an idea of what was going on, more or less. But perfect time to drop a new decision that's controlling. So this is a case where the respondent is from Guatemala, and they had been here for quite a while. They had 6 qualifying relatives, 5 U.S. citizen children, and his permanent resident mother. So the children are ages 12, 11, 8, and 5.
Okay, so just stop right there. That case walks into your office.
Oh, and 2 months old. Sorry, 12, 11, 8, 5, and 2. Yeah,
that case walks into your office, and you don't know anything else about it. You just know, the person qualifies. They have this number of kids. They have this permanent resident parent. What do you think their chances are?
Well, it's a stone cold winner, in my opinion. Without knowing more. I mean, in my opinion,
right.
Just knowing that, you'd have to have some really strong mitigating factors to make it a loser. Like, oh, he's got 5 kids and $1 million in the bank account, which would make relocation super easy.
And he also has 5 DUIs.
And he has, right. I actually remember early in my career, Jonathan Love, the trial attorney in Seattle who got caught forging documents to get people deported.
When did you come on the show?
Yeah, Jonathan Love, if you're out there, please come on the show. But I remember having an individual hearing in a case just like this, a soccer team of kids, basically. And we went in, we sat down, he comes in, he sits down, and he goes, well, turns to the respondent, you're not going to get arrested again, right? All right, well, that's all I needed to know. And then he stipulated to a grant of cancellation just out of the sheer volume. Because again, hardship is in the aggregate, right? So if you've got one kid suffering hardship, it's going to be harder to maybe reach that level. But if you've got 5 plus a mother, those scales are necessarily tipped in your favor, no matter what the other factors might be. So
it's kind of common sense, right?
Yeah, it's common sense. So
okay, let's talk about the decision now.
In Guatemala, good place or bad place to go right about now?
It's a beautiful country.
Beautiful country. I've been there.
People are wonderful.
I loved it.
I think it might be hard to raise a family there. They have certain challenges historically and presently. So yeah, not the best place.
So the respondent's 8-year-old daughter has hypothyroidism, a condition that she's had since birth, which requires regular medication to treat the condition. And if she doesn't have her medication, she starts to have problems regulating her metabolic functions, like the temperature of her body. So that's a big deal, right? That alone, maybe I got 1 kid, but I got that. I'm feeling pretty good about myself, right?
Well, I mean, but the medical system in Guatemala is probably top notch.
It's probably very good. The oldest child went to counseling for a few months in 2016. They were sort of acting out, having aggressive and defiant behavior, but that kind of didn't really go anywhere. And then the 11-year-old was attending the same counseling services for about 5 months in 2018 and was diagnosed with anxiety disorder, unspecified, and ADHD. So, there were some of those factors. He had a mother who's a permanent resident, so she counts too. She had been diagnosed with hypertension, so she has heart issues and needs medical care. And what else am I missing in terms of the hardship?
I think that was it. I mean,
yeah.
Do we know what court this was out of?
I'm not sure.
And was it the IJ who denied it, or did he grant it and it was appealed?
No, the judge denied and the board upheld. So let me make a couple observations first about this in general, which are, you never know in a case like this. It's possible. Sometimes the board will be like, there's no evidence on the record of X, Y, or Z. And it could be that the lawyer did a bad job. It could be that the client did a bad job. You've had those cases where you're begging the client for pictures of the family home in Guatemala or letters or documents, and they just don't follow through. And sometimes it's just that they're ignoring the evidence that's on the record, and we don't know what the record looks like here. But one thing that does come up is this issue of relocation or separation. judges really want the respondents in these cases to state their theory. At least in my experience, most of the judges don't like a sort of vague, I don't know what I'll do. I've had judges get very angry with that type of answer because they say, you've been in removal proceedings for 6 years. How can you tell me that you haven't even thought about what you would do if I order you removed today? But there is a psychological barrier, I find, when prepping clients to getting them to decide what they will do if deported, because deportation is such a big deal.
So you typically want them to say that they're relocating back to their country.
Well, yeah, but
I want them to say what they're going to say, but
right. And I guess what happened in this case is there was some ambiguity because I think he and his wife testified differently. And so then the court comes away not really knowing what is the family plan. But my point is just that it's hard sometimes to get them to come up with a family plan that they can explain to the court, because the whole point of going to court is to avoid being deported. And so people are not anxious to plan.
You're a dad now, twice over. And how cavalier there are judges and government attorneys can be with the whole well, you can be deported and your wife and kids can stay here.
Right.
No biggie, and you really have to rebut that. Yeah, there is a big difference, without the father in the house. He plays an important role. And unfortunately, a lot of our male clients tend to have that machismo about them where they're yeah, I work. I go and I work. And trying to get to see how they're important for their family and their children other than bringing home a paycheck can be challenging because they're not wired that way. Sometimes it can be disheartening when you hear even male judges just completely diminish the role of a father in the household.
Right.
That was their side, maybe.
Well, no, it seems to me that for ICE and a lot of the judges, separation is a way to cure the hardship, because the idea is, oh, your daughter has a medical condition. If she just stays behind, she can still go to the same doctor. But then they totally fail to take into account the hardship of permanent and prolonged separation from a parent, which to me is almost worse than I can't get my asthma medication, or I can't get it as cheaply as I could in the US. So yeah, that's definitely something that happens.
So the whole standard, the whole setup sucks.
Yeah. I've also had ICE attorneys recently tell people that, well, you could just stay behind, and to make up for your husband's lost income, you could get public benefits. Couldn't you? This is on cross-examination. Couldn't you get food stamps, even though you don't get them now? Yeah, I guess I could. Couldn't you get public housing assistance? Well, okay, I guess. On the one hand, the narrative...
So it's the father's always diminished to basically dollars.
Right. Your dad is just a dollar sign, but also at the same time, the government is saying immigrants are public charges. They're literally going to court and saying that immigrant fathers could just be replaced with public assistance, and it's a wash. So there's that. But anyhow, they talk a little bit about the decision, because apparently, we're going through these facts and they sound pretty good to me, but it wasn't enough for the board. So what's up with that?
Well, they talk in the decision about public benefits. And there was that confusion of the wife said that she would take the kids back. So I think there's a lot of confusion. And is that the attorney's fault? Is that the client's fault? Is that the court's fault? Lots of times I have IJs write decisions and they're really confused about something. It's I know it's pretty clear to everyone else. So I think it was the mother who testified that she had health care. She had health insurance in Guatemala, or she said that she believed that there was health care in Guatemala, and the wife said there wasn't, they wouldn't be able to get insurance. Mm-hmm. So the judge said, and the board said, well, we can't really take what the wife's saying about the healthcare system. Who is she? We can't take her word. She's not credible on that fact. But the mom, we're going to totally credit her, for there possibly being healthcare in Guatemala. So basically, the girl probably can get her medication in Guatemala, mm-hmm. and it just doesn't she doesn't reach it, and they don't look at anything in the aggregate. Like, what's it going to mean for the other children together? Because there's one thing to, and as you know, because you have two now, to raise one child, but things start to get harder once you start adding them together.
Right.
You know, I couldn't even imagine 5 kids. No, I couldn't even. In the best of time, and I do fine, and you know, I'm very privileged and all that. But that would be really hard. Can you imagine 5 kids in Guatemala?
It's a lot. It's a lot of kids. You know, one thing that I've had judges do, and you probably have too, which is really annoying, is, you know, in this case, you're presenting a number of factors. You've got the emotional hardship of a child being separated from an elderly parent with heart disease. That's a stressful situation for the mother. You've got the number of kids. You've got one kid with a serious medical condition.
Yeah, but the elderly mom can take the bus.
Right. The decision.
Right? In the decision, they said there's no evidence that the mother couldn't take the bus to her medical appointments.
Right. I know with my mom, she says she loves me, but if she had access to a bus, I don't know that she would know the difference. I'm just a bus to her.
You're just an Uber.
So
just an Uber to her.
So again, in the aggregate, that's the key, right? But I've had judges say, well, yeah, this guy, he's going to have less economic opportunities in Guatemala, but that enough is not sufficient by itself, which is true. That's in one of the cases we cited earlier. And the kids, they're going to have less educational opportunities, but that by itself is not enough. And they go through and they explain that each one on its own is not enough, and so therefore it's not hardship. Well, that's the opposite of the standard. The standard is in the aggregate. But a perfect example is this sentence from the decision. It says, while the respondents' children may face fewer economic and educational opportunities in Guatemala than they would have if they remained in this country, both in the short and long term, economic detriment is generally insufficient to support a finding of the required hardship. Well, the first part of the sentence says economic and educational opportunities. That's 2 things. And then, on the back end, they lump it all into economic detriment, which is not enough by itself. And so they've sort of codified this thing that really pisses me off when judges do this, which is to just go through looking for the cancer or the stroke patient or whatever, the one big thing, and that's not the law. It's really annoying.
Yeah. And so, this is a pretty radical departure, and it's going to be interesting to see because these types of cases are really hard to attack up in the federal level. I think this case is out of California, right? So it'll go up to the Ninth Circuit if they choose to do so, which I imagine they will, but they're really hard to attack. So I want to ask you now, why do you think this decision came out now?
Well, you know, it's just after 20 years, it's just really important to clarify those, you know, I don't know. I couldn't.
So here's my theory. So we'll delve a little bit back into minutia for our non-immigration lawyer friends. The stop time rule. Maybe Stephen mentioned that you have to show that you were here 10 years. And the 10 years is calculated in the olden days when the notice to appear was served upon the person, the document that was charging you with deportation or removability. Now, there's been certain cases that have come along to say that the notice to appear has to be done in a certain way. And probably 95% of the cases out there, the notice to appear wasn't done in the correct way to stop the time. So a person that was maybe put into court in 2012, and their court case is still going on, which is totally possible, and they had entered the country in 2010,
right?
Well, they wouldn't have been eligible for cancellation, but now they would be because the time keeps accruing because the mechanism that stopped the time isn't working anymore because of the federal courts.
In other words, thanks to the Supreme Court, hundreds or thousands of people are aging into cancellation eligibility.
Right. So now they're going to be able to apply for cancellation of removal. And so the Ninth Circuit found this way. The Third Circuit just recently did. The 10th Circuit did as well. And it's fallen that way. And I think the BIA and the Department of Justice understand that the writing's on the wall, that they're going to lose this issue. Will eventually go to the Supreme Court, and they'll lose at the Supreme Court.
Right.
So I think this is kind of a preemptive, okay, you all may be able to apply, but you're not going to be granted.
You're not going to win.
This is my theory. And also my theory is that in short order, we are going to see a BIA case that says that immigration judges can preterm cancellation of removal cases based on a lack of requisite hardship before the hearing ever takes place. That
would be interesting, yeah. I think that's exactly right. I hadn't thought about that, but that's a really good point. That's why I host the show. We screwed up by not following the law, and now thousands of people qualify for this green card application, essentially, and so we've got to do something on the back end to block them. That's really smart. I did want to mention one other thing about this decision. The wife had testified that she'd read on the internet that treatment for the hypothyroidism costs $1,100 in Guatemala. And the judge found that she hadn't presented any evidence to corroborate her testimony. And then there's a footnote that says even if she submitted a printout from the internet indicating the medical treatment for hypothyroidism costs $1,100 in Guatemala, the immigration judge would still need to evaluate the relevance and reliability of the document and weigh it along with the credible testimony presented. In other words, it
doesn't matter.
They didn't like her testimony because she didn't have enough evidence. But even if she had evidence, I mean, they're kind of saying, it's from the internet.
I mean, why didn't they bring in some medical expert from Guatemala? I'm sure this family with 5 children, had a lot of money hanging around to hire experts and all that. One of the listeners I'm on, one of the attorneys says, well, this just shows that you have to have an expert on behavioral theory, on medical things. And she was listing all these experts that we're going to need for these cases. And I think she was doing it unironically. And it's my clients can barely afford to pay me,
right?
And now they're going to be paying, thousands upon thousands of dollars for experts for these things.
And on top of that, I mean, yeah, it's absurd. I mean, again, these people aren't provided with free lawyers, so they have to pay for their lawyers. And some people are pro se, so they're going in, they don't have a lawyer at all. They're just depending on their testimony. In most of my cases, even if you wanted to get an expert, so for example, I've got a client from La Mora, Michoacan, Mexico, and his family lives on some ranchito, some little tiny farmland, way off the main road. And there's no work there. And so I have to depend on the second or third hand testimony or letters from those family members saying, yeah, there's no work. We work only a few months out of the year because it's very seasonal or whatever. And this little footnote and this whole thing about, well, we just don't believe you is going to make it hard or impossible for people who are pro se or people who are represented. Because even in this particular case with this fact, sometimes you can get psychological experts or experts on certain things, but it's hard to find an expert on Guatemala medical system.
Well, it's funny. It's but then judges and government attorneys leave their common sense and everything they know about the world behind.
Right.
It's funny. You have an indigenous Guatemalan woman saying there's no work in Guatemala, and they're how do you know that? Well, how do I know that? And have you read the news? Have you seen what goes on in your own courtroom?
Have you read the State Department's own human rights report? I mean, they also will rely on the respondent's testimony in other ways on cross-examination. So they'll say well, ma'am, do you remember ever seeing a hospital when you lived in Guatemala? Well, yes, there's hospitals in Guatemala. Don't they have doctors in those hospitals? Yes. Is it possible that they treat, this condition that your daughter has? I guess it's possible. Well, that's case closed against your client.
Yeah, my favorites are so ma'am, are you saying that there's no police station in your town? No. How far away is a police station? Oh, it's about 30 minutes. Well, that's not very far. Well, that's if you have a car. I don't have a car, so I have to walk. So it takes me 5 hours.
Right.
You're you have a phone, right?
Could you have called
Well,
them?
we have access to a phone. The phone is a 30-minute walk away. But the thing is, not like these government attorneys and judges don't understand the landscape in Guatemala. Trust me, they've all done enough cases from Guatemala to understand what's going on there. And then for the judge to be like, yeah, well, I'm not sure. You say it's $1,000, you say this, but, I need some concrete evidence. It's just crap. It's just, I do want to see the underlying immigration judge's decision, because I was kind of shocked reading it that the immigration judge actually denied it, because I don't know many judges, at least I deal with, that would deny that case.
I know. Well, and it's possible that maybe the case was poorly prepared, but I think about me going into court with, okay, I got a kid with a lifelong medical condition that can like up her body temperature if she doesn't have her meds. I've got 5 other kids and an LPR mom with heart disease. I don't want to say this and admit to malpractice, but I could see myself going into court, maybe having, made a few assumptions about which way the case would go, and not necessarily being like, oh, well, we need to pay $1,000 for an expert on the healthcare system in Guatemala to testify about X, Y, and Z. I mean, some of these things should be common sense.
Also, we talked before about attorneys that will put people into immigration court proceedings by filing asylum applications.
Right.
And I don't think this was the case here, but here you could see an attorney looking at it goes, 5 kids, LPR parent.
Right.
Yeah. We'll put this person in proceedings.
Let's do this.
And maybe it was something where they had a judge that was really favorable, and the case took a long time to kind of wind its way through, and that judge left, and they got a judge that wasn't very good. We've had that happen before.
Right. That's a good point. It would be interesting to see what went on underneath. And again, this could have been an attorney who, fought like hell and did everything they could do. We should add, Aaron Hall on Twitter brought this up. The second part of the decision is on the denial of his withholding application. It turns out, by the way, we're an hour in, by the way, there's a gang in Guatemala that wants to murder him and his entire family. And they were like, yeah, but that's not enough for withholding. Withholding is essentially like a harder to get asylum. And they didn't take into consideration the fact that like this guy has credible death threats against him in the hardship calculus. Like maybe if your dad is going to,
be murdered, and maybe if you're going to be murdered along with your dad.
Right. So,
getting murdered is a quintessential hardship.
Right. It seems like it'd be pretty hard. Well, no, it's not the qualifying relatives. It's just their dad. It's just their dad. Anyways. No, because they're the qualifying relatives. So. Oh, if they get murdered.
I mean, it's hardship. Yeah. I mean, if you get murdered, that's hardship to you, right?
I would think so.
I mean, you're a pretty tough guy, so.
At the end of this, we're an hour in. This sounds kind of Nietzsche. Maybe this won't affect that many people, but honestly, like for the guy who I mentioned at the beginning, who can't bring himself to vote for Joe Biden, if this was the only bad thing Trump had done on immigration, this one decision, it would be worth spending 10 minutes of your time to go and vote for Joe Biden. On this alone.
Yeah, this decision is mean.
Because it's not...
It's mean. It's
It's
right?
not a handful of people. These are thousands of people. These are people who necessarily have lived here more than 10 years, who have good moral character, who have strong ties to our country. And we've just said in this decision, yeah. Despite all of that, we got to really see that one of your kids is like seriously f***ed up in order for you to stay. And yeah, it's bad. But anyhow.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go have some wine and cheese right now.
Okay. Wow.
So
bourgeoisie.
Yeah, that's what I do. Yeah. So you stay safe. Wash your hands.
You too. Take care of yourself, and we'll talk to you later.
All right. Love you.
Love you too. Bye.